In this episode, we're going to turn the phrase governance strategy into something you can actually explain in plain language, because beginners often treat strategy as lofty business talk that sits far away from real decisions. Governance strategy is the practical plan for how the enterprise will steer IT decisions so they consistently support where the organization is headed, while also respecting the constraints the organization cannot ignore. Those constraints might include limited budget, limited staff capacity, legal obligations, risk tolerance, or technology realities like aging systems that cannot be replaced overnight. If you ignore constraints, governance becomes wishful thinking and people stop taking it seriously. If you focus only on constraints, governance becomes defensive and stops enabling progress. The balance is the point. A governance strategy makes choices about priorities, decision rules, and oversight so the enterprise can move toward its direction without falling into chaos or unacceptable risk. By the end, you should be able to describe governance strategy as a set of leadership choices that connect enterprise direction to decisions, measures, and accountability, with constraints treated as real boundaries rather than inconvenient details. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by defining enterprise direction, because governance strategy cannot align to something that is unclear. Enterprise direction is the organization's chosen path, including its goals, its priorities, and the trade-offs it is willing to make to reach them. Direction might emphasize growth, efficiency, customer trust, innovation, stability, or a mix that changes over time. It also includes the organization's identity, such as whether it competes on low cost, premium service, speed, or reliability. In governance, direction must be expressed in a way that can influence decisions, not only in inspirational language. A direction like become more customer-focused needs to translate into decisions about reliability, data quality, and service responsiveness, because those are the IT-enabled capabilities that customers feel. A direction like reduce cost needs to translate into decisions about standardization, automation, and retiring duplicate systems, because those are how cost becomes measurable. Governance strategy is the mechanism for converting direction into decision behavior, which is why it sits at the leadership layer. When exam scenarios mention strategy drifting or misalignment, they are usually pointing to a weak connection between direction and governance decisions. Now define constraints in a governance-friendly way, because beginners sometimes hear constraints and think only of budget. Constraints are the limits and obligations that shape what is possible and what is acceptable, and they can be financial, regulatory, operational, or risk-based. Financial constraints include budget ceilings and the reality that funding one initiative means not funding another. Regulatory and legal constraints include obligations to protect data, retain records, or follow industry rules that impose minimum control requirements. Operational constraints include staffing limits, skills gaps, and the fact that critical systems cannot be disrupted without business impact. Risk constraints include the level of downtime the business can tolerate, the amount of security exposure it can accept, and the reputational damage it cannot afford. Technology constraints include legacy systems, vendor contracts, and architectural decisions that make some changes expensive or slow. A governance strategy that ignores constraints tends to produce unrealistic plans that collapse under pressure, leading to exceptions, bypasses, and confusion. A governance strategy that respects constraints builds credibility because it acknowledges the real world and still finds a path forward. The exam often rewards answers that recognize constraints and incorporate them into governance decisions rather than treating them as afterthoughts. A useful way to understand governance strategy is to see it as a set of choices about how governance will operate, not just what policies will exist. It includes choices about where decisions will be made, how standards will be enforced, how risk acceptance will be handled, how performance will be measured, and how conflicts will be resolved. It also includes choices about how much governance rigor will apply to different types of decisions, which is sometimes called being proportional. For example, A governance strategy might decide that enterprise-wide platform choices require centralized approval, while local workflow tools can be chosen by departments within defined boundaries. Another strategy choice might be that high-risk changes require formal review, while low-risk changes follow standardized processes without extra approvals. These are strategy choices because they determine how the enterprise will balance speed, consistency, and control. Beginners sometimes assume strategy is only about what goals to pursue, but governance strategy is also about how decision-making will be structured to pursue those goals reliably. When you can explain the how, you can answer many exam questions that ask what should be established or improved. To align governance strategy to direction, the enterprise must define what outcomes matter most and how IT contributes to those outcomes. If direction emphasizes trust and compliance, governance strategy will prioritize strong oversight of risk, clear ownership of controls, and consistent assurance practices. If direction emphasizes rapid innovation, governance strategy will prioritize decision speed, clear delegation, and guardrails that allow experimentation without unacceptable risk. If direction emphasizes cost efficiency, governance strategy will prioritize portfolio discipline, standardization, reuse of platforms, and benefit tracking to ensure investments pay off. If direction emphasizes customer experience, governance strategy will prioritize service reliability, responsiveness, and data quality, with measures that reflect customer impact. In each case, governance strategy is a translation layer that chooses which governance mechanisms to emphasize and how to measure their effectiveness. This is why governance strategy is not a generic template. It must reflect what the enterprise values most right now. On the exam, the best answers often connect governance mechanisms to enterprise priorities rather than recommending a one-size-fits-all governance approach. A key part of strategy alignment is establishing decision principles, which are simple rules that guide choices without requiring leaders to reinvent the logic every time. Decision principles might include prioritizing initiatives that directly support strategic objectives, choosing solutions that reduce long-term complexity, avoiding acceptance of high risk without explicit leadership approval, and enforcing consistent data definitions enterprise-wide. These principles are not detailed procedures. They are the guiding criteria that make decisions consistent across different teams and situations. Principles help especially when constraints create pressure, such as a tight deadline or a sudden budget cut, because they provide a stable way to choose what to preserve and what to defer. If the organization values resilience, a principle might be that critical services must meet defined reliability expectations before new features are added. If the organization values speed, a principle might be that standardized platforms should be preferred to avoid long approval cycles. Governance strategy includes defining these principles and embedding them into decision forums and oversight practices. Exam scenarios that involve inconsistent choices across departments often point to missing or weak decision principles. Another element of governance strategy is choosing the right governance levers, meaning the mechanisms leaders use to influence behavior. Common levers include policies, standards, decision forums, funding controls, performance measures, risk acceptance processes, and escalation paths. The strategy question is not whether to have these levers, but how to apply them to support direction and manage constraints. For instance, if resources are limited, governance might use funding controls to focus investment on a smaller set of high-value initiatives instead of spreading money thinly. If regulatory obligations are strict, governance might strengthen standards and assurance practices to reduce compliance risk. If decision speed is critical, governance might streamline forums, clarify delegation, and define thresholds so only the most impactful decisions require escalation. The levers must work together because policies without enforcement are weak, and enforcement without clear standards becomes arbitrary. Governance strategy is the plan for how these levers will be coordinated to shape decision-making across the enterprise. When exam questions ask what leaders should implement to improve governance, answers that select and coordinate the right levers for the context are often correct. Constraints often create the toughest governance trade-offs, so we should make the trade-off thinking explicit for beginners. Imagine the enterprise direction demands rapid delivery, but regulatory constraints require careful control and documentation. A governance strategy might respond by standardizing repeatable controls and building streamlined approval paths that still produce the required evidence, rather than adding manual checkpoints that slow everything. Imagine the direction demands cost reduction, but operational constraints include fragile legacy systems that cannot be retired quickly. A governance strategy might respond by prioritizing stabilization and targeted modernization that reduces risk and cost over time, rather than forcing abrupt cuts that increase outages. Imagine the direction demands stronger cybersecurity, but staffing constraints limit what can be done immediately. A governance strategy might respond by focusing first on the highest risk areas, clarifying risk ownership, and improving oversight, while planning longer-term capability building. These examples show that governance strategy is about sequencing and prioritization under constraints, not about perfect solutions. On the exam, answers that acknowledge constraints and propose a structured, principled response tend to outperform answers that promise instant transformation. Governance strategy also must define how the enterprise will measure whether governance is working, because strategy without measurement becomes opinion. Measurement in governance is not only about technical performance. It includes indicators that show alignment, value delivery, and risk management. Alignment measures might include the extent to which investments map to strategic objectives and whether priorities remain stable across departments. Value measures might include whether expected benefits are realized after delivery and whether outcomes like customer satisfaction or operational efficiency improve. Risk measures might include the frequency of significant incidents, the number of unresolved high-risk issues, and the quality of compliance outcomes. Governance strategy defines which measures leaders will review regularly, how often they will review them, and what actions will be triggered when measures show drift. This is where operating rhythm matters, because measures must be tied to decision cycles, not just collected. Beginners sometimes think measurement is only for reporting, but in governance, measurement is an input to leadership decisions. Exam scenarios that involve surprises and recurring failures often imply that measures were not reviewed or not linked to corrective action. A strong governance strategy also includes communication and adoption planning, because governance only works if people understand how to use it. If decision rights and principles are not communicated clearly, people will default to old habits and informal decisions. If stakeholders do not understand why governance rules exist, they will interpret them as obstacles rather than as protection and alignment mechanisms. Adoption requires leadership behavior that reinforces governance, such as using the defined forms, respecting thresholds, and refusing to accept unmanaged exceptions. It also requires making governance processes usable, meaning they are not so complex that people avoid them. For beginners, it helps to think of governance strategy as not only designing the system, but also designing the behavior change that makes the system real. If leaders bypass governance under pressure, they teach the organization that governance is optional, and the strategy fails regardless of how well it was written. The exam often tests this indirectly by presenting scenarios where formal governance exists but is ignored, and the best answers involve strengthening enforcement and leadership commitment rather than creating more documents. Another essential component is adaptability, because enterprise direction and constraints can change, sometimes quickly. Governance strategy must include a way to revisit priorities, measures, and decision rules without creating instability. This does not mean constantly changing governance, but it does mean having a regular review process that checks whether governance still fits the enterprise context. If a new regulation appears, governance strategy might need to tighten controls and oversight in certain areas. If a major market shift demands faster delivery, governance strategy might need to streamline decision forums and increase delegation while maintaining risk guardrails. If the enterprise acquires another company, governance strategy might need to adjust structures and standards to integrate systems and data responsibly. Adaptability is a governance strategy feature because it protects the enterprise from drift and ensures governance continues to support the current direction. Beginners sometimes assume governance is static, but effective governance evolves while preserving clarity. Exam questions that mention changing environments often expect you to recommend review and adjustment mechanisms, not a one-time governance redesign. It is also helpful to recognize what weak governance strategy looks like, because many exam scenarios describe weakness through symptoms. One symptom is when governance is reactive, focusing on fixing problems after they happen rather than preventing recurrence through clear decision rules and oversight. Another symptom is when governance is inconsistent, where different departments follow different standards and leaders make exceptions without rationale. Another symptom is when governance is disconnected from strategy, so IT investments are driven by vendor pressure, individual preferences, or short-term crises instead of enterprise priorities. Weak strategy also shows up when constraints are ignored, leading to unrealistic plans, frequent delays, and a culture of constant exceptions. When you recognize these symptoms, you can propose governance strategy improvements that restore alignment, clarify decision principles, and embed oversight and measurement. The exam often asks what should be done to improve governance effectiveness, and answers that address strategy alignment and constraint management tend to be strong. To close, developing governance strategy that aligns to enterprise direction and constraints means creating a practical plan for how governance will steer IT decisions toward what the enterprise values most, while respecting the limits and obligations that shape what is possible and acceptable. That strategy translates direction into decision principles, assigns which governance levers will be used, and defines how decisions will be made, monitored, and corrected when performance drifts. It treats constraints as design inputs, not as excuses, and it sequences priorities so progress is realistic rather than imaginary. It also establishes measures and operating rhythm so governance becomes a feedback loop that keeps IT aligned over time, even as conditions change. When you can look at a scenario and ask what the enterprise direction is, what constraints apply, and what governance strategy choices would keep decisions aligned and accountable, you are thinking the way CGEIT expects. This mindset will help you in the next episodes as we embed compliance, culture, ethics, and operational rhythm into governance, so it becomes a living system rather than a set of disconnected rules.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.